Great, so let's make a start. We're really glad to have Professor Jim Harris with us again. Jim, as many of you know, is Professor of Environmental Technology at Cranfield's University of Soil and Agri-Food Institute. We heard from him as a speaker in person pre-pandemic at the University of Bedfordshire, where we used to meet. And we especially wanted to invite him back after seeing his excellent blog post about why tackling biodiversity loss and net zero and negative carbon, tackling those together is essential. We can't separate them. So Jim will talk for about 45 minutes. It will be quite a lot to take in, as these are really important subjects, and Jim, as you may know, does not do things by halves. So there will be time for questions, as I said, in the chat function. So ideally save those for the chat function in the end, unless you can't possibly wait, unless you want a memo as well of your thoughts as you go along. But we try not to use it too much because it can be distracting. And as I said, we aim to finish by 9 o'clock. So Jim, let me hand over to you.
Thank you, Lucy, and thanks Lucy and Colin for organising, and thanks everyone for turning up. Can you all hear me? Thumbs up will do. Excellent. So I'm going to share my screen, I hope. Can you all see that? Excellent. Now there's going to be there's quite a lot to get through, but rather than insult your intelligences, I've actually, rather than sort of, made things so compact that they're meaningless, there are some important bits of science here that I'm going to try and get across. So I thought about this subject for a long time, and we can I don't know how it went on mute then, but thanks everyone. Here I am again. There's quite a lot to go through, and we're going to I'm going to take you through some quite complicated diagrams that it'll be clear why I've done that. And I was saying that I've approached this subject in this way because so often as society we tend to tackle things as if they are a single issue at a time. We'll deal with a single issue at a time. And one thing that is quite apparent to me as a systems ecologist, everything is connected to everything else. You might be sitting in a room watching a piece of technology, but you're breathing oxygen, and give this a thought, every second breath comes from the ocean, and every first breath comes from the terrestrial ecosystems. It doesn't come from anywhere else, and so we are connected in that sort of superficial level in one way, but very profound level in another way. And so I thought I had to say something about we can't keep keeping these things separate, and I'll explain what will happen, what has happened, by just saying, well, let's deal with one thing and then we can deal with the other thing. In something as complicated as this, we need to look at the lot. Now, some of these images are quite shocking in many ways, and I just want to get the sort of I'm sure we're all on the same page, but I want to get some of these images out there, the kind of things that we're facing. We now got huge pollution. We've got waste that's not being recycled. We've got forests being cleared for food and for other things, and some terrible situations. And we're entering a stage of looking at tipping points occurring. So we've got poaching, we've got most intense animal production that's leading to all sorts of problems, not only for us in our diets, but also in terms of the amount of carbon emissions that are used, the amount of land that's used. You have to use 10 times as much land per kilogram of animal meat as you do for 10 kilograms for a kilogram of plant protein. Soil erosion, and the one on the bottom right, it just breaks my heart. These polar bears are trying desperately to stay alive by simply searching for scraps because of what's happened. And this is another striking image of an eroded landscape. This tree is just about clinging on. One day that will fall over when the rest of that erodes. We all know that there's been these incredible increases in temperature year on year. We get new records broken, frequency of drought, frequency of flood, frequency of hurricane. They're all increasing. And what's driven this is the increase in human population and the intensity of our socio-economic system. Our primary energy use, this is all from the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Aid. There's a few people not on mute, and I can hear all sorts of rustlings and shiftings about. I know you've got to do that, but if you could mute, it would be really helpful. So we've got increases in primary energy use, the amount of food production, international tourism has gone through the roof since the middle of the last century. Transportation in terms of millions of vehicles, water use, cultivated land has all increased. Now, that of course has led to some of the problems that we've seen in the top part of the diagram here, increases in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, sulfur dioxide, although that started to come down, that got tackled somewhere in the mid 80s and 90s. Nitrogen being flushed out of our terrestrial systems into the oceans, terrestrial biodiversity loss, water stress, temperature stress, and increase in temperature. But we have as a society benefited, or some people have, of course it's very uneven. Malnutrition has reduced, child mortality, no access to sanitation has declined. The amount of people with electricity has increased, extreme poverty has declined, access to education's improved. So there have been some pluses, and yes, this is a very uneven, unequal distribution of benefits, and in particular the global south is suffering horribly as a result of some of this development. So the question comes, well, why don't we do this? We fix the climate, this is terrible, this is happening, we've got to deal with it now, let's do it. The problem is you can get unintended consequences of having policies aimed at a single metric. So a good example of this was the EU's 2003 biofuels directive that meant that by 2010, nearly 6% of all transport fuel in the EU is supposed to be biofuel. For 2020, the target was 10%. But these targets didn't specify if and when food crops may be used to fuel biofuels, and how to prevent forests from being cut to make way for biofuel crops. Result, mature forests being cut down to be replaced by monocultures of palm oils and other species. Primary rainforests swept away to be replaced by vast areas. I've been there, and the only things there alive appeared to be palm oil and mosquitoes. The rich diversity disappeared. And it's because the sole focus was on carbon emission reduction. So I think that and there are reasons, there are good reasons, scientific reasons why we should be doing this anyway. And I'm going to try and take us through those as we go along. And the reason why it's just as important as climate change is these two things are intertwined. And this is some work done by Tim Lenton, published in 2008. And this is from Wikipedia, this particular image. And we've got, at several points, we're on tipping points. This isn't just going to be a linear degradation. It's going to be a sudden collapse. The Gulf Stream, I'm sure you've heard of, with the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, the waters become less and less saline. It's that salinity that powers the conveyor. Change in the El Nino system, boreal forests die back, the greening of the Sahara, which is a mixed thing. It's interesting. Monsoons, permafrost lost, and now the instability of the West Antarctic ice sheet. And there's been some huge ice sheet collapses in the last few months that we've witnessed. These are interlinked, and it's impossible to just fix one of these things. And, you know, I've got this picture up, this iconic species, as a sort of a bit of a indicator of where we are. And I've put this, you know, is this animal stuffed? Well, this actually is a stuffed polar bear. And if we're not careful, that's all we'll have left. There's a very complex story to do with polar bears, grizzly bears, and other bears, but I'll leave that for another day. But we've got some, we've got the, I think some people are still on, haven't muted. I'm still here chatting going on in the background. So what are the drivers of this loss in biodiversity? And then I'll come back to how it relates to climate change and how it's related to solutions. We've got the loss of habitat. Now I'm going to explain that in a moment with conversion of land uses. We've got with thinning, fragmentation, or just destruction, invasive species which have been brought to areas where they would never have been seen before, that have got no pathogens, for example, so their populations explode. And of course, in places like Western Europe, many of our systems, well, none of our systems are pristine and natural, and very often forests have been planted using, in effect, just one or two parent trees, meaning that if one of them succumbs to a disease, they're all going to succumb. And that's why we've had these huge things like the poplar dieback, etc., have all been down to that. Overexploitation, harvesting of too many fish and terrestrial animals, depleting stocks, pollution, of course, and of course climate change associated with global warming, because many animals not only have very strict temperature range requirements, they also are synchronized with the other parts of the ecosystem. And if you've got birds emerging from their eggs before they've got anything to be fed on, because the caterpillars haven't come out yet, because they've responded to a changing climate, increasing temperature at a slower pace, we get this phenomenon of asynchrony, where we haven't got the different parts of the ecosystem working together. All of this will lead to biodiversity loss. So these primary drivers, however, do give us an indication of where we should be acting to try and reverse the loss in biodiversity. And here's an example from Lade et al. 2019, and they indicated potential feedbacks between loss of biosphere integrity and climate change. So if you start in the top left-hand corner here, direct human impacts on biodiversity, and we know that that happens and you get loss, but that has knock-on effects, these asynchrony effects, lagged species responses, organisms appear too early or too late and they're not integrated, they've lost their integration with the ecosystem. That has impacts on terrestrial carbon storage. Consequently, the global carbon cycle is affected. We're getting ocean acidification, climate change, permafrost thaw. This is a horrible potential positive feedback loop, negative feedback loops are where we want to be. Changes in marine biodiversity, the marine biological pump. So these are cascading and interrelated effects, and we simply cannot just focus on the one. And I keep saying it, but it's important. So this was the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, where they did a model of what the historical rate of extinction was in the past. So this is the natural rate of extinction. Throughout time, species have gone extinct. There sometimes they've just the mutation, the climate changes, and they've not been able to respond, but a very low rate. We're nearly an order of 2 magnitudes greater now at the moment, 1,000 times higher than the fossil record, because of all of these pressures on habitats. And we're heading for even 10 times higher than that. And that amounts to, and the estimates that came out of IPCC a couple of weeks back, was that we could be talking about anything between, at the high end, 3 and 52% of all species, Well, even at 3%, which is present in all of even the most optimistic projections, that's over 250,000 species. And that 250,000 doesn't necessarily not include us. So we really have to be aware that we've got this huge issue that we have to deal with. I know I'm getting gloomier and gloomier at the moment, but it does perk up a little bit later on. So, and different groups are differently affected. On the right, we've got the IUCN red list categories, from those at least concerned that are green, and then all the way down to the red, which are critically endangered or even extinct. And you might be surprised to see the arrangement of some of these groups. The bony fish and gastropods are the least threatened, as indeed are birds and dragonflies, although we've got these big data gaps for some of them. For birds, there are so many people interested in birds across the world that the data for birds is absolutely excellent. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the data for things like gastropods and crustaceans are much lower and we don't know quite what's going on with some of them. But this is one of the best estimates. This is the United Nations in 2019. And some groups, such as amphibians, dicots, so flowering plants that we'd be used to, i.e. not grasses, conifers are very great. And this group, the cycads, popular garden plants, but they are of a very great risk, simply because they are so tied into their habitat type. Changes in precipitation are critical to them. So we've got, it's not everything. It's some groups are going to suffer more than others, but we don't know the importance necessarily of all of these different groups. So we really ought not to be saying we can do without some of them. We will have to, but can we do anything about it? So I've got a series of graphics from the amazing visual capitalists to take you through. This first graphic nicely illustrates what the Earth's surface is, how it's divided up. Yes, we call it the planet Earth. Many people, particularly marine biologists, said we should call it the planet ocean. Of the terrestrial part, about 3% are glaciers, about 6% is deserts and salt flats and what have you, exposed rock. And then we've got this habitable bit in the middle, which is where we concentrate our activity. And if we got in our time machine and went back 10,000 years, where humans were still mainly hunter-gatherers, this was the kind of division of land use in the habitable bits. 1% fresh water, just about 150 million hectares, and then 4.6 billion hectares of grassland, prairie. There are all sorts of theories at the moment about what forests look like. Closed canopy forest was perhaps unlikely, and it was more like pasture woodland because of the influence of really big animals, at least as big as elephants, and these shape for lands with forest and grass in them, and then the rest forest, including the tropical, temperate and boreal forests. If we fast forward 5,000 years, more or less the same picture, but you can just about see we're starting to creep in over the left side of this pie chart, with crops starting to be established in places like Mesopotamia. Egypt, Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley was really where the only things where anything was going on. We're there up to 1700, and surprisingly, perhaps a bit more, but not a tremendous amount more than that time in the past, in what was becoming then the historical past. But we have got more grazing, far more grazing, forests more or less the same, but some more cropland at this point. Go to 1800 and those changes are just about starting to accelerate. 1900, much more cropland. 1950, and here we go, far much one. Grazing is really starting to come in. Grazing lands now at 31%, and today this is kind of where we are. So that forest land, those natural grasslands have been squeezed. Urban areas, and of course that's where most of the people are that need the food from these areas. So huge impacts on change in land over that time scale, and what that means of course is then it's impacted on biodiversity in a very significant way. There's a link to the Visual Capitalist. It's a fantastic site. They've got all sorts of visual resources. So why is this important? Well, we need to think about the way in which ecosystems work and the importance of biodiversity, and that then plays out in terms of function, architecture of the system, and the coupling between the living and the non-living parts of the system. So the first thing, and this is an exercise I do with my students, is what is biodiversity? And there's been lots and lots of attempts to be made to define this term. If anyone comes up with a term that absolutely everyone can agree with, because it tends to be used as a synonym for all life, but we need something that we can measure if it's going to be really useful, directly or indirectly, that we can manipulate experimentally and practically if we're going to put things right or understand what's going on. If you do come up with a definition that the world will agree, I'm sure you'll be at Stockholm receiving your Nobel Prize next year. It's a long-term fraught problem. But the basic definition accepted by everyone, and is a very good working one, is the variety of life in all its forms, levels and combinations, which includes ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and very, very importantly, genetic diversity. So these are all features that we need to think about when we're talking about how are we going to reverse this mass extinction? How do we keep, what is it that we need to be doing if we are going to preserve those things which are already alive? We can think about individual organisms, populations of organisms, and communities of organisms. And those communities consist of different species interacting with one another. There's lots of ways of thinking about this. And one, people talk about diversity, simple numbers of species, and that's a good start. But a species list will only get you so far. Importantly, we need to understand the richness. What are the numbers and abundances? Because without the abundances and the relation of the different species in terms of their type, their function, the way they feed, the way they reproduce, and how abundant they are, you get no idea of whether you've got an ecosystem or not. So an example I often give is that you could have 40 varieties of duck on a lake, and essentially you've got a duck pond. If you've got 39 varieties of duck and a fox, then you've got an ecosystem, because then you've got the start of a trophic web, and you've got interactions and feedbacks going on. So it's incredibly important, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, because then people can run away with the idea. So okay, any area with a high number of species is diverse and therefore must be a functioning ecosystem and is resilient, and that's fantastic. Well, the London Zoo is one of the most diverse places for animals on the planet, but clearly it's not a functioning ecosystem. It's artificially maintained. Now, I think that zoos have got a big place now because of what's been happening. I'm going to have a big place in trying to reverse biodiversity loss. I'm happy to take questions on that later on if anyone wants to, if anyone's interested. Without integration into an ecosystem, biodiversity is without function. So we simply can't just have biodiversity. We've got to have it with these other components. And the importance of biodiversity is a very, very old idea. And I was surprised when several years ago I came across this quotation about is it important. Here's a quote: "It is better to have a multiplicity of species than a multiplicity of individuals of one species." That's St. Thomas Aquinas. That's 700 years ago that someone had spotted that systems needed to be diverse. And in the, nearly said the last century, it was the century before, in the mid 1800s, Charles Darwin said it has been experimentally proved that if a plot of ground be sown with one species of grass and a similar plot be sown with several distinct genera of grasses, a greater number of plants and a greater weight of dry herbage can be raised in the latter than in the former case. And he was directly referring to experiments at Rothamsted Station in Harpenden, which is the longest running experimental site of any sort on the planet. And to quote that other philosopher, Joni Mitchell, does it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? We don't know the function of many of these things, so we've got to preserve as much as everything as we can, because we have these things called trophic cascades. And trophic cascades are the way in which ecosystems, the organisms in a system, not only interact one another directly by grasses being eaten by herbivores and herbivores being eaten by predators. Very often these organisms provide mounds that other organisms take advantage of. These so-called ecosystem engineers are critically important in providing systems. And this is above ground. This is an example from United States, prairie system. If you look below ground, it's even more complex. And I think I said to you, in a teaspoon of soil, you'll have something like 7 or 8 billion individual bacteria representing 10,000 plus species and 50 kilometers of fungal mycelium. Incredibly complex. And what's happening here is that we've got decomposers and these shredders and higher level predators and top level predators in a soil system. These are all interlinked and they're making feedback loops. And feedback's incredibly important when we're looking at degraded systems. And you might, if you just took it at a very simple level, is okay, this is Yellowstone National Park. We've got a lot of the trees are old, but back in the 1920s, wolves were removed from the system. And since then, there are very few new recruits to the system. And in fact, since the 1970s, there were no new tree saplings. And that's simply because they were overgrazed. They could never get a start. The reintroduction program immediately led to the establishment of new trees, because wolves, it wasn't simply a mass effect of fewer predators, fewer herbivores. Wolves created something called a landscape of fear, which moved these herbivores around the landscape, which meant some areas got a chance to recover and establish younger age classes of trees. So here's a direct, you'd say, okay, what's the pressure on the tree? It's the herbivores. Let's plant more trees. Let's shoot the herbivores. No, you could actually reinstate the ecosystem and start to get that back. And it's incredibly important because this is another graph, another figure that absolutely shocked me when I first saw it. This represents the Earth's land mammals by weight. You can see we're in the middle here, the dark grey. The lighter grey is all our cattle and livestock, pigs, goats, sheep, horses, domestic pets are down here somewhere. But the green ones is all that's left of the mammal population. It's just extraordinary. And what it means was, if we halved our livestock, we could increase our wild mammal biomass by an order of magnitude or two, so 10 or even 100-fold more, simply by reducing our livestock. And the other benefit of that, coming back to linking these two things together, if you look at the diet emissions by food type, sure enough, meat is where most of the emissions are coming from in terms of carbon dioxide and methane. And of course, methane burped out by ruminants is a much more potent gas, climate change forcing gas, than carbon dioxide. So that's one thing where we could start to say, okay, there's something we can do there. And more importantly, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment back in 2000 identified that a lot of things that we get in our terms of our benefits from nature, in terms of food, fiber, climate regulation, flood regulation, our cultural, spiritual, aesthetic interactions with nature, are all dependent on biodiversity. And from these, we get these constituents of well-being, security, basic material for a good life, health, good social relations, and freedom and choice of action. And this ecosystem service language has become incredibly important, because from that, you can start to value nature. Now, valuing nature was never intended to mean monetizing nature. However, in some cases, it is possible to put a dollar value on some of these services. And it was that step that got the attention of finance ministers. And it was that step that brought biodiversity and climate change into these major international agreements. Because what we've been doing with this natural capital, the biodiversity, the massive diversity, its interactions, is losing part of this natural capital by degrading it or covering it over in hard, disconnected, impermeable infrastructure. And this means we've got lost services. By ecological restoration, we can get some of those services back. Now, it's a very complex picture. There's no need to take all of this in, don't worry. But we've got a sort of a spectrum of land use. There are wild lands, very few of those in Western Europe, far more in places like America, South America, Australia, and in Siberia and places like that. We're more used to some of these systems, some of which are novel ecosystems that we've never seen before, and they're emerging, through to intensely used systems. The question is how much can we reverse this trend by retaining these benefits? First of all, we must protect what's already there. Lots of carbon is tied up in soils and vegetation and the permafrost. That's what's in the atmosphere. That's the bit that's been causing all the trouble, the 385 figure there. Land use change has contributed another 185. But we've got the deep and intermediate ocean with a vast store on the surface ocean. And then in the crusts is where most of the carbon is, but most of the time that's not bothering us. It does reappear during volcanoes, volcanic eruptions and emissions. So the first thing we've got to do is stop putting more into the atmosphere, but also is to protect what we've already got, because a lot of carbon is stored in boreal forests, above ground, far more below ground. Temperate forests, there's almost a balance between the two. Temperate grasslands, there's still quite a lot there, mainly underground, very little above ground because we take that off as a crop. Tropical forests, deserts and semi-deserts, tundra, and this surprises many people, although there may not be much above ground, there's a tremendous amount of carbon stored in things like peat bogs, mangrove forests and what have you. And here are our cropland numbers. Again, we've shrunk the below ground carbon here. So we need to protect what's already there. That's the first thing. And we have to realize that not all systems are equal. This shows you there's a tropical forest, and this shows you the amount of carbon that's stored in seagrasses, for example. I don't know if anyone saw Country File a couple of weeks back, where these seagrass restoration programs are starting to appear. Seagrass is amazing at storing carbon. Salt marshes, mangroves and oceanic mangroves, vast potential for restoring and burying carbon, and at the same time putting biodiversity back. Now the good news starts. We're in the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. The potential, again, I won't test you at the end, the potential for storing carbon by restoring forests, grassland, agricultural management improvement, and wetland is huge, and that's where we need to go. So one of the things that he said is, let's plant 1 trillion trees. The global tree restoration potential, published in the journal Science, I'm going to show you the figure in a moment, said that there's this potential for, essentially, by planting 1 trillion trees, we could basically help with the last 25 years of emissions. But it's been pointed out that we've been emitting carbon dioxide since about 1760 in increasing amounts. There are currently about 3 trillion trees on the planet. So 1 trillion is a full third increase, fantastic. But there used to be 6 trillion trees. Can we go to that for a target? And this was the superb graphic that they produced to show what the potential is to where that tree cover is and where it could be done. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So, okay, you say, okay, I can see why carbon needs to be protected, and I can see that biodiversity, but what's the interplay between these two things? So what I've done now is pulled out some examples from the scientific literature to give you a flavor of the kind of things that people are now discovering. This was some work done in India, where they looked at the diversity of forest systems and tried to work out what were the factors that were controlling the amount of above ground carbon, biomass carbon. And what they discovered was that the diversity, richness, so this idea of the number of species and their abundance, was a big player in increased above ground carbon. So there's, okay, so if we made a target of, rather than a single species or a couple of species, we're going to not only bury carbon, we can actually double the amount of carbon that we store. And of course, by doing that, we're restoring biodiversity. Another piece of work from China looked at what's the impact of tree species richness on all of the carbon pools. And not only did you get this increase in tree carbon, not in the herb layer, and that's simply a function of where that sits in the ecosystem, but also everything else. This is total carbon. This is the litter, this is the dead wood, this is root carbon, this is soil organic carbon. They all increase with increasing diversity. So if you're going to put things back, please don't put monocultures back. Please put back these mixed complex systems. There might be some areas where you have to put a monoculture back in, because more species equals more carbon fixed per unit area. Also, put it in the right place. And I don't know how many of you remember back in the 70s and 80s, there was this get rich quick scheme where people were draining peatlands and planting trees on them. What an utter disaster that was. This is some work done again recently by Friggins et al. And the important thing to note here is on the bottom we've got heather, birch and pine. It wasn't pine planted 39 years ago in these two other places. But essentially what is happening is that these trees are reducing the amount of below ground carbon, and consequently what you're doing is you're getting a shift from below ground to above ground carbon, but not as much. So consequently it leads to a loss of moorland, which is a biodiverse system. You're simply transferring the carbon above ground. You're reducing biodiversity because you're just planting a few species, and pine is a particular problem here because that's being planted for wood use. So we need to restore the right species in the right place, and the work has been done in broad brushstrokes as to where we can do this. This is work done in by Shah et al. Communications in Earth and Environment, again just out, and this is showing where the carbon gap is. This is the difference between how much carbon there is being fixed every year and how much carbon there could be. And the dark green areas shows the places where you could make great big advances with the carbon sink potential by optimal land use practices. So the Society for Ecological Restoration has got this idea that you've got this continuum of things that you can do, and let's not forget about restoring biodiversity in urban areas or installing biodiversity in urban areas, which is tree plantings and many other things. We can get along this sort of restorative continuum to fully functioning systems. We've got to make the journey. We've got to start moving in places to do this. And we've got to still produce food, of course. We can change our diets, that's going to help. But we can also move from intense agriculture where we're substituting everything in terms of fertilizers, cultivation, biocides and what have you. In some places, that's the only way you can produce food. But in other places, people are already starting to show how using things like cover cropping, moving from tillage to no-till, minimum till systems, through to regenerative agriculture, to things to rewilding. And of course, wilding and rewilding is still producing food because there's meat produced from these systems, although they're doing other things culturally. And this is quite a hopeful sort of picture of, if we get this right, this decline can be halted and reversed by probably 2070, something like that. If we just do conservation, we'll end up with just stabilizing it at a lower level than today. If we carry on business as usual, well, the whole thing's going to collapse. Increased conservation efforts plus sustainable production plus sustainable consumption, then we can really turn the tide, and that's what we've got to be aiming for. Moving from this system of bad management, land management and degradation, to ecosystem restoration. And there are all sorts of fabulous approaches to this. I was looking at a farmer-led land management program that's been going on in Africa, where it's simply looking at what's there already and looking after it properly can increase carbon, but also improves the soil, improves the environment. It's a fabulous story. Also, priority areas for ecosystem restoration have been identified, and the red areas are the ones where the highest priority should be given, the bluest the lowest, and of course Western Europe, North America, very often places where there are intense restoration efforts. But in terms of doing the best good, we need to be looking around tropical areas and coming back to that carbon map. These two are very, very close to one another. So we'll be burying carbon, dealing with climate change and dealing with biodiversity loss. Let's not forget about urban forests and the work that we can do. And I'd love to see crikey, I have to take a run up to it as well. Miyawaki forests, intense, very close planting in areas the size of no bigger than a tennis court in an urban area, where you've got a ground layer, shrub layer, tree layer. You could get amazing growth and carbon burial and very high biodiversity returns. But we depend on these things for our mental well-being, and we can improve our climate resilience as well as improving biodiversity. In the last couple of months, I've seen a red kite on more than one occasion flying up and down where I live in the Castle area of Bedford. Fantastic, absolutely fantastic. So imagine that we've sort of got this ship, the planet Earth, and we've been pushing the engines on full. I wish that was red on the right hand side and green on the left, but it's not. It's just bear with me. We can either go full ahead and carry on degrading the planet, or we can go to reverse. So we've got our hand on the lever at the moment. If we pull it back by stopping biodiversity extinction, linear resource use and fossil fuel use, and get to net zero and then degradation neutrality, we'll just be idle, standing in the water, as it were. We need to be going in reverse with ecosystem restoration, improved agricultural management, a circular economy where we don't simply extract, use, dispose into the environment, renewable energy sources. And that way, can we not only avoid heading towards a destroyed, dead planet, we can get a regenerated, healthy planet. And so let's stop losing the parts to protect nature and restore the whole and reconnect ourselves with nature. And I think that's really what we need to be doing. Almost exactly 45 minutes, I'm delighted to say.
Excellent. Thank you, Jim. You've taken us through a lot. It's been a bit bleak, but as usual, you give us hope as well. So if anyone would like to ask some questions, feel free to type them into the chat. While people are doing that, my question is kind of a basic one for you, Jim, but there's often a lot of criticism for environmental charities on focusing on sort of conservation in terms of glamorous mammals, the big mammals. The
charismatic megafauna.
That's the one. How do you feel about that? Do you not blame them, or do you think this is just a way to get across to people and bring the money in so that they can do, what they need to do?
There's not an easy answer to that. There are some charismatic species which are apex predators, and there is, without doubt, they are critical for ecosystem function. Other things, perhaps not so much, but then all I can do is fall back on the precautionary principle. We don't really want to lose anything. And hence my comment about zoos and zoos having an important role going forward. I think that it's understandable when people get obsessed with a single species, but sometimes that can translate into that species above any other species. And it's led to some very difficult conversations. Hedgehogs in certain Scottish islands, for example, they have been destroying native fauna. There are other cases where it's easy. I mean, you don't get the Rat Appreciation Society being heard when New Zealand is exterminating rats on islands. They quite clearly have been introduced. I think rats are incredibly clean and intelligent animals myself. I don't keep one. My dog wouldn't like it. Well, it would like it for about 30 seconds. But the thing about that is that if there was something that was a keystone, absolute keystone species, which was a foot-long, foul-smelling cockroach, I should think that it would be more difficult to get a groundswell of public support for something like that. Whereas in fact, it might be quite important. And there are things there we don't even know that they're important, and there's no advocacy for them. Similarly, we're going to have to get to grips with being absolutely tied to some of the current things that we've got out there in terms of priority habitats, because they're under threat because of climate change. They're very often trying to respond to that.
Thanks, Jim. So we've got some questions in the chat. Shall we start off with Annie's question? Well, it's more of a statement. So Annie says the main driver in the UK of biodiversity loss is development, destroying wildlife habitats. Surely, unless we stop build, we can't stop biodiversity loss.
So that's an interesting, that's again, all of these things have got a wicked problem aspect to them. Because if you could build on a agricultural field which has been in intense arable production for 50 or 60 years, you might be able to build an urban area that is far more biodiverse and functional than that agricultural system is, which has been dedicated to a single end of producing wheat, we'll say, or barley. Of course, we need to eat. So, you know, this isn't, that's why it's not a simple answer. Sometimes the problem isn't necessarily that we're building everywhere, although there's certainly the way we build at the moment is not sustainable. It's where are all of those other considerations? You know, I don't know if you remember, what was it, 5 years or so ago, 10 years, eco towns. We were going to have eco towns everywhere, and that just faded away. And I think that consequently we need to understand that there are subtleties in this. Certainly knocking down a pristine ancient woodland in favor of a new estate is not helpful in the least, quite the opposite. Putting a modern, attractive, zero carbon, biodiverse town or village on an agricultural site might be quite a good thing to do. Even more important, retrofitting those features in existing towns and starting to use the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of empty properties that there are in the UK. You know, why don't we do some more of that? Fortunately, I'm not a politician.
Thanks, Jim. Annie, does that answer your comment, your question? Do you want to come back on that?
Hi. Oh, Jim, you know, recently I wrote an article. Now, meadows excel at storing carbon. Those lands you said that for 50 years have been in arable use, they have the potential to be something fantastic biodiversity, because I think, well, as I say to you, I just quote, this is from Plant Life, the biggest levels of carbon sequestration happen when you convert an arable field into a species-rich meadow. Grasslands excel at storing carbon. So if we took that big, say, 800-acre field that's been used for arable, and you just plant hedges in it and put meadows in it, and, you know, and a little bit of arable, and do it, as you say, regenerative farming, then surely the biodiversity will come back. It's the thing is, Jim, we're losing so many acres, and it's good arable land, you know, high quality, and they're building on it when we've got, I mean, this doesn't go down well with a lot of people. We shouldn't be having second homes. We shouldn't be buying holiday homes. And students, I'm sorry, but, you know, you go to any big university town and you know, there's streets upon streets of accommodation for students only. We have got the houses. We do not need to build on our good arable land. We can do, but I mean, there's no way we can I mean, we're one of the most nature depleted areas, you know, in the world, aren't we? One of the most nature depleted countries in the world. And unless we stop building on the land that we need for biodiversity, we're not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, you know, absolutely. But it's again, it's a political question, and you asked me a technical question, and I gave you the sort of the technical response in terms of what you can do with biodiversity in new builds and in and retrofitting. I don't disagree that you know, the way that we, in fact, I said we need to look at our existing housing stock and improving it, and the sort of the how to put this, interesting energy strategy that we now have that seems to completely ignore insulating our houses. I went to a lecture from a government minister who said we could insulate every house in the United Kingdom for 1/10 of the cost of the nuclear program. And that was Tony Benn in 1979, giving a lecture at the North East London Poly that I was fortunate enough to be at as a student at the time. And I lived at home, by the way, rather than in student accommodation. And even then, politicians were saying, well, that's what we need to do. I won't get into the politics of that. Great big companies, as opposed to individual people going around insulating people's lofts. Think about that one. But certainly there's a big problem with existing housing policy. I wouldn't disagree with that. And how many times have we seen houses being built on floodplains and disasters that comes to?
You know, Jim, why aren't you scientists being listened to?
Have any of you seen the film Don't Look Up?
Yeah.
I would urge you to see Don't Look Up, because it was absolutely panned by film critics. And essentially what these scientists have discovered was an asteroid heading towards the Earth. And it tells the story about how they're trying to get this message out, and the way in which it was trivialized by the media and by the politicians. And there's this one thing where the young scientist absolutely loses it on a program and screams, "We're going to die," and with several other Anglo-Saxon words in that. And I sat there and said, that's what I feel like. That's what I felt like for the last 30 years. It's very interesting to see that, you know, that it's not all doom and gloom. There have been great moves to take it seriously. It's getting everyone lined up. I mean, I've been involved in those negotiations at UN bodies and what have you. And I don't know if you've seen the big IPCC report that's come out, like that thick. I was involved in the previous IPBS one. And you're literally starting at 7 in the morning and finally crawling off to bed or the bar at 3 the following morning to get up again at 7 o'clock. And you're negotiating. I was in one session and we spent 2.5 hours on a single paragraph with all the nations involved, arguing about a word, the placing of a comma, the emphasis. And at the end of the 2.5 hours, we ended up with exactly the same bloody paragraph as we started off with, it having gone through various cycles. So it's complex. And the reason why it takes so long to do these things is, at least at the end of it, all the nations that have signed up to it agree to it. But it's a slow process. And that's just how it is, I'm afraid.
So
and that's why some of the things, yeah.
Sorry, Jim, I was going to say that question, how do you get Annie's question, how do you get people to listen to you, scientists, is also asked by Heather, and you've answered it very well. The Don't Look Up film, it just typifies the problem, doesn't it? The celebrity distractions, and we're not listening to the scientists. Heather also has another question. She says, on your ecosystem restoration slide, the bulk of optimum ecosystem restoration required appears to be in the majority world. Who is likely to pay for this restoration? And if no one is willing to, will it happen?
Okay, so that's not an either or thing at the moment. There are, so this is where things like carbon credits and clean development mechanism type approaches are helping. There are some places that are in the majority world who are being paid to maintain protection of their ecosystem. So it is starting to happen. Is it widespread enough? No, it certainly isn't, but at least that's recognized. It's calibrated. And it's interesting because some companies are really starting to take this incredibly seriously. The insurance industry in the city takes it incredibly seriously, and there are already moves that companies will not insure companies who are reckless environmentally. We've seen the rise starting in America, and now it's being spread out of something called the B Corporation, which isn't simply predicated on the old Milton Friedman maxim of the only business of a company is to increase value for its shareholders in monetary terms. And we have something in law called the fiduciary responsibility of CEOs and boards, executive and non-executive, to give shareholders a premium at the end of every year. Well, B corporations don't have to do that because they're allowed to balance that with their social responsibility and their environmental duties. And so companies like Ben and Jerry's for years sometimes return a very little, if not negligible, premium to their stakeholders who buy into it on the basis of they want to see their profits being turned into rainforest protection or new rainforests. So, you know, I'm optimistic. Whether it's fast enough is another question. I don't know the answer to that. Currently not. And with what's going on at the moment, who knows? But so we are paying for it, and is it enough? Probably not. Is it in all the right places? Probably not. But there are some places where it is happening. But the other thing is, we can't simply go around the planet saying, you know, here's a few $1 trillion, you do this, you do that. A lot of this has to come from grassroots of people, literally, taking the initiative and being supported. And that's why this sort of farmer-led regeneration type programs that we're starting to see pop up are starting to really pay off in terms of reversing desertification, what have you. And that's a case of, you know, sharing, facilitating, and what have you. And I mean, at Cranfield, we have people from 101 nations on the campus at any one time, many of which are coming from the majority world, and they're taking that kind of thing back.
Thanks, Jim. So next we've got a question from Eric. He says, picking up on single species, what are your thoughts on the release of billions of genetic mosquitoes in California to combat diseases? Would this upset the eco balance, good or bad?
It's not my area of expertise. That sounds like a horrible cop-out, but being a scientist, I have to say that. Mosquitoes have got a place in ecosystems, and we've got a balance between who's affected by disease, because it's very often those who are most deprived who suffer the most. And this might be the lightest possible touch for dealing with an overabundance of mosquito brought about by mismanagement of ecosystems. We're now in a triage type situation, and we're in a drastic type situation. And again, it may well be that this is one of those things that might just work and doesn't at least involve spraying everywhere with toxic chemicals. The real danger is what happens if the modification gets into other species. I'm not expert enough to know whether that's even possible, but it might do the job in at least half a way as possible. And, you know, we've made decisions to exterminate species and organisms in the past. We have deliberately made smallpox extinct in the wild. And if you look at the people who are most affected by that, it's been a really good thing. So it's again, there are no black and white answers in this. It's all various shades of grey.
Thanks, Jim.
These are all personal opinions. Other opinions are available.
Thanks, Jim. So Peter's got a question about food.
Yeah.
I'm surprised there aren't more questions about food. Actually, do type your questions into the chat. Pete says, is it true to say that we all have to accept as a species that our food has to cost more as we look to more sustainable food production? Has anyone tried to put a percentage figure on this? And given the massive inequality in incomes across the planet, is there any sense that the rich nations should shoulder a greater proportion of the cost to accelerate the process?
Wow, that's a complex question. Let me try to unpick bits of it, and as I say, get as close to it as I can without providing an absolutely definitive answer. We do not pay the full cost of food production at the moment. We pay for the pollution caused by use of intensive and misuse of intensive fertilizers in our water bills, because essentially what happens is that we remove the pollutants from surface waters in wastewater treatment plants and water treatment plants, and then we pump them back into our houses, and that is a cost caused by us not paying the full environmental cost for food production. So in the end, you pay for it. There is literally no such thing as a free lunch. You're going to be paying for it somewhere. And it's a case of, well, what if you could actually reflect the true carbon price of meat versus vegetables, protein? Would that then give us the signals that we need in the market? But at the same time, you know, it's all right for me to say that there are some people. I mean, the Bedford Food Bank, it's shocking the number of people who are having to rely on that on food. And would you deny them? You know, people who take advantage of that kind of thing, understandably, meat protein as, you know, something to look forward to. It's a horribly complex question, but I think we do not pay the full cost of our food at the supermarket checkout. We're not paying for the carbon that's been used to transport exotic food items across the planet. We're paying for that through what's happening with climate change. So perhaps we do have to accept it.
It's a big question, isn't it? And then there's also the industrial food waste as well, because there's a kind of food bank, a larder in Bedford that deals with that and diverts really good quality food to those in need, but also to anybody.
Yeah. Well, another, you know, absolutely. And there's another shocking statistic, is that between farm and supermarket, there is probably about 3% wastage, unavoidable wastage. From supermarket to household use, that goes up to 40% food waste. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But it's very hard to get everything, you know, organized. I seem to be answering more and more questions about socioeconomics than I am about restoration and science. So that's fine. Yeah, I have opinions on almost everything. Sometimes several.
It's hard to separate them, isn't it? And a lot of people engaged with these things are really engaged with their sort of political solutions as well, which I know you are as well. Tricia says, if there's time, we seem to be doing okay for time. Are you able to give her your quick thoughts on the value of electric vehicles?
Wow.
In a
right, okay. So right, that's not ecological restoration, but you know, I can see why you're asking. and I am the chair of environmental technology, even though I am a systems ecologist. I think electric vehicles for private use are fantastic, and they're not going to be the answer for buses and trains. That's going to be hydrogen fuel cell type stuff. We are going to run into problems with supply of lithium and other nickel and what have you, and then we're going to have some hard questions around, do we get these things out the ground and attempt to restore because we need to shift away from fossil fuels? But I'm a fan of electric vehicles, and I can remember, in fact, it must have been about 5 years or so ago, Robert Llewellyn, who used to play Crichton in Red Dwarf, gave a talk at the White Hart around the corner from us on his advocacy of electric vehicles and just the sort of shenanigans that certain people at a very top program on vehicles and the telly got to try and disprove that electric vehicles were any good. Yeah, I'm a fan of electric vehicles, and it's some of the ways in which the improvement in battery storage and range, availability of we've got to do a huge amount on availability of charging points and ways of charging are coming along. There's a bit of a tidal wave coming. So I was delighted to see last month's statistics that there were more electric vehicles sold last month, or new registrations last month, than there were in the whole of 2021, sorry. Yeah. So yeah, I think that they're going to be an important part of the mix, along with more public. I mean, if you really wanted to solve it, you'd make public transport free, and that would be a huge step forward. What's the chances of that, eh?
That would be a game changer, wouldn't it? Absolute game changer. A couple of people have asked a really good, simple but important question. Eleanor and Jane really on the same line, saying, what can we do to improve the situation? What can we do locally as individuals? What would your top priorities as individuals?
So I'm just looking at Jane's list: become a vegan, cycle more, insulate our homes better. Certainly cycle more, certainly insulate our homes better. I think become flexitarians. Myself, if you want to be a vegan, that's absolutely fine. We have evolved to have a proportion of meat in our diet, and I'm a little concerned that so I had a very long discussion with someone who's a Native American in one of our ecological restoration conferences about part of eating meat was respecting the animal tribe. It was a complex and very deeply spiritual conversation. And I think that we evolved as omnivores. We wouldn't have as much meat in our diet as we had then, as we've got now. Of course not, but I still think that could be part of this. So I think flexitarian would be great. I mean, that would be huge if we said we're going to eat meat twice a week, and we just adopted it. I mean, look what happened during the Second World War with rationing, and that generation of people of very healthy in many ways, in other ways not so much, but that kind of thing can help. The insulating our homes is going to be critical, and where are the schemes to do that?
Thanks, Jim. So yeah, reducing demand by insulating seems very obvious, isn't it, and basic. So thanks, Eleanor and Jane, for that. So plenty to think about. Martina's got a question about education, I think. She says, understandably, action and effort needs to happen right now, but why is there not a curriculum starting from early learning years and going up to GCSE? Obviously, we've got the natural history GCSE coming in, but not till 2025. So we need to raise the next generation to continue protecting and shouldering those efforts, she says. Seems midterm very effective and less likely to face the same objections you experienced at the UN negotiations.
Yeah, I think that has been happening. I mean, certainly I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Of course, my daughter's got it simply because they're my daughters and they got it from me. But many of their classmates are totally aware in the, of what's going on and what needs to happen. As you say, the natural history, is it GCSE? It is vital. But there's also quite a lot of retrofitting going on. Talking of retrofitting, where, for example, at Cranfield, we have a level 7 apprenticeship called Sustainability Leadership. Companies are sending lots, I mean, really hundreds of students to us to understand sustainability, to take that back into their companies. And it's not the usual suspects. It's not just food companies and those kind of companies. We're getting people from banks, from insurance companies, from construction companies who are wanting to have properly informed staff who become actors within their companies. And in many cases, many companies are ahead of political thought, which is sometimes dragged backwards and downwards by some very reactionary views on things. I mean, it's interesting. My granddaughter, who's 20 months old, has her first nature and science picture and word books, and she's starting to learn those. And she did pick a pack of leaf litter up the other day in the park, and I asked her what's that, and she said rubbish. And so there was a little bit of education that then followed. But I'm quite optimistic. I think young people are far more aware of the issues than we would have been at school, and we just need to do more of that.
Thanks, Jim. So I missed a question from Heather. She says this is sort of more of an economics question, maybe. Green growth or degrowth is either possible?
So there are no growth scenarios that have been explored. Certainly there are green growth scenarios. There's a shift in many, it's funny, in many places there is a shift from consuming things to consuming experiences, as people are starting to realize that actually one of the major impacts on good health and good well-being is positive social interaction, and that means that you don't feel better by buying the latest gadget, or you actually spend the money down the pub talking to mates and that kind of thing. Degrowth, again, I'd refer you to Kate Rayworth's Donut Economics. I think there's a lot we can learn from that. And Heather, if you're going to read it, I actually listened to it on Audible, and I found that a great way of doing it. Is that we've got to consider not just the ecological planetary limits, we've also got to think that the basal social framework which supports us. So we've got this kind of donut that we should be operating in. In terms of degrowth, if we're talking about the countries that are already well and truly up and beyond their ecological limits, but there are other countries who turn around and say quite rightly, well, you've had yours, we want ours now, thank you very much. And
sorry Jim, the ethics around it is just can't get my head around them. And I read Kate's book a few years ago, and what she's doing with Amsterdam at the moment is just incredible. And it's the first economics book I've ever read that I actually thought, wow, somebody's got it. And I don't understand why it's not mainstream economics and why she's still heterodox.
Well, that's very interesting, because we've been sneaking it into the Cranfield curriculum over the last couple of years, and it's starting to get quite a bit of traction. And we're doing that in terms of its relation to the 5 capitals approach of understanding systems and building resilience. It's a fascinating story of the accidents of history of the way in which economics developed. Because if you go back to some of the very old economists, they got it and never imagined what was actually going to happen in the future. And it wasn't until the late 40s and 50s where, and I can't remember who it was trying to teach, I think it was, and I think Kate Rayworth gives this story, trying to teach economics to servicemen coming back from the Second World War, many of whom were engineers. And so it turned some economic principles from algorithms into diagrams, as if somehow the economic system was a machine. And that's what caused the problem.
Yes.
It was a tactic in class that led people to believe that somehow the economic system works as if it was a machine.
Like a tank, wasn't it, with an overflow tank or something? That's in her book, isn't it? Yes. And
it always revolves around the central conceit of the sort of the perfect consumer who responds to price. I can sell you a piece of canvas and a few oil paints, and it'll cost you about £5, but if that £5's worth of paint was put on the canvas by Picasso, it would be several million. So we don't act as rational consumers most of the time, as it turns out, and we're making all sorts of decisions around that.
And we don't have perfect information, and we assume that every country's economics and within that country, particular society's economic system works the same, which is not true. And there's some really interesting stuff around economic anthropology versus economics, which is interesting as well. But that's not your subject. I'll shut up now. Thank you.
Thanks. So we've got a few minutes left. So I think probably 2 more questions. One from Colin. He says, can you say a bit more about the economic drivers we need to have in place to improve the biodiversity?
Wow. Great questions, everyone. I just wish I had about 5 of my colleagues with me. The economic drivers have to move away from unrelenting linear economy, extract, manufacture, use, dispose from the environment into this circular economy. And how can we make that work? It won't work for everyone, and some people will ignore it. We still see fantastic excess use of consumption, conspicuous consumption as some kind of badge of worth. So you've got this strange mix of people who want to do things for moral reasons. People will do things in response to incentivization, and people who won't do something unless it's legislated for, and that goes the same for companies as well as people. And we're going to come up against some really hard economic drivers in the next few years, I suspect, with what's going to be happening with grain prices, with what's happening in the dreadful situation in Ukraine and other places. We're going to be confronted with that, and we're going to have to confront some hard questions, hard choices, not least in the energy strategy, half-baked, or only half a strategy because it's not got the demand end in it. The question of will nuclear have to be used to plug the gap? Looks what's happened with Germany. We're not going to have any more nuclear power, and they're sending Russia $1 billion a day for oil and gas. It's I never thought it was true until one day I was in Dublin and I asked someone how to get to Phoenix Park, and got the response, I wouldn't start from here if I were you. And it's kind of like that. It's kind of counterfactuals all the time.
Thanks, Jim. So I think we'll go 2 more questions. So this is one from Charles, and it's about land use and changing land use and humans competing against the natural world. And he says, as a result, of that, a huge proportion of the population, especially in the developing world, identify themselves as food producers, but the technologies needed to satisfy the demand for food without further encroachment depend on high tech and high investment. So he's thinking about things like hydroponics, which we've got out in Sharnbrook now, vertical farming, artificial meat, etc. How do we address the economic, societal, I don't know how to say that actually, can't say that, sorry, social, I'm going to say, and personal conflicts that will be caused by the transition? So land use obviously is a big question. Is that too big a question to answer in 2 minutes?
Do you know what? If I answered all these completely perfectly, I'd be up for about 3 Nobel Prizes in economics and physics and peace.
Yes.
So thanks, Charles. It's a very good. It's a very good question, of course. Okay, let's try and pull some of these apart. I've got an interest in hydroponics, vertical farming, and aquaponics, where you have a closed system of plants and fish. I think there's a role for that. I was listening to Farming Today a few weeks back, and there was someone who was vertical farming and said, we've cracked it for salad crops. There's no question about that. One of the huge advances that came in vertical farming and glasshouse farming was the development. Again, this shows you the connections between different systems, was the development of, and I was at a meeting of the Linnean Society when this chap from the European Space Agency was showing that they'd invented a new suite of LEDs lights that were bright, which produced in very narrow wavelengths of light. And plants have these 2 photosystems, photosystem 1 and photosystem 2, and they're stimulated to fix carbon and produce oxygen just by those wavelengths. There's a green component which is to do with plant health, but it's this red and this blue component. And those LEDs use something like anything from 1/10 to 1 or 2% of a standard growth lamp. That has been a huge shift in the economics of the system, because you need far less electricity, and at the end everything is energy, information and materials. And so I think that there's great stuff still to come. In terms of artificial meat, that's a really interesting one. Why bother? Why not just simply accept that you're going to have a plant-based diet and you're going to have things which simply taste the plant? That's great. There's a lot of these early adopters, as I said, in this first group of people who want to do things. But the fact of the matter is we've evolved to find meat incredibly tasty, and 90% of the population wants to eat something that tastes like meat. So if you can produce that from plants, why not? And take another huge swathe of actual meat off the hoof, off the land, to produce more plant material and put some of those ecosystems back into good heart, as I think Annie was saying earlier. So that can be a way of getting to the right place. And there are lots of smart people out there addressing that kind of thing. I don't know if anyone's heard about, it was a project on Cost of the Earth, where the use of very fine, these nanoparticles, sugar dots, can actually increase photosynthetic efficiency, the project I was involved with. There are some really smart answers. What we've got to be careful of is that we understand what their effect on the whole system might be. So there are some high tech improvements. On the other hand, in a lot of those places that have got very poor, what you might call subsistence farming, can be improved by some very simple landscape management interventions. We've got a question from Lisa's son.
Yeah, I think this is going to have to be the last one. This is a really nice question. I don't know Lisa's son's name, but he's 16, doing GCSE geography. Could brownfield sites be used to restore ecosystems?
Yes. It's in many ways where ecosystem restoration started. There was a very famous scientist from University of Liverpool called Anthony Bradshaw, and he was looking at some sites which were badly polluted by metals, and he thought, well, what can we do to revegetate these sites and start to restore some ecosystem characteristics? The problem with brownfield sites is if they're contaminated with metals, you've got to try and avoid something called biomagnification, where the plants have got metals, they can survive, but then animals eat them and they start to concentrate that up until you get to the top predator, which you kill. So that's careful choice of plants. But what he did is he thought about, well, what can I do? I've got these lead contaminated sites. And he had a thought, and he had a look in his history books, and he went to a place in Wales which had the remnants of a Roman lead mine that had been abandoned 1600 or so years ago. And he simply looked around for the plants that were growing there, because guess what? They were all adapted to living with lead and had done so over the 1600 years since it had been abandoned. And he used those as the basis to produce plants which could survive on metal contaminated land, and could also be used to, you can actually remove metals over time using that. But in terms of restoring ecosystems, providing you haven't got pollution, they can be excellent places to try and restore ecosystems, because very often they're very poor in nutrients. And diverse systems often love to be in systems where there's not lots of nutrients flying around. If you've got lots of nutrients, you favor species, so-called ruderal species, which can grow incredibly quickly and actually sort of squeeze everything out of the system. But yeah, it's happening. A lot of brownfield sites are, and some brownfield sites have developed on their own as rich and valuable ecosystems. I'm currently intrigued by a site on the north wing of Bedford Hospital, which has not been touched for many years. It's producing some incredibly interesting and rich flora over there. I just dread to think what happens when someone says, "Oh, right, we can put a new building up on there," because it looks pretty good to me at the moment. So yeah, Lisa's son, you can definitely use brownfield sites for ecosystem restoration. Chernobyl, yes, in the news for the wrong reasons right at the moment, Charles. But again, I've had colleagues go there, fantastically diverse. Simply by some people not wanting to go there. You can actually buy vodka brewed from grain grown at Chernobyl now, I think. I'm not absolutely sure. But yeah, their nature will come back, but we have to get our foot off of its neck.
Thank you, Jim. I think we need to wind up now. Thank you everyone for so many good questions and for having some optimism as well. I think we all have ideas about the way we want to see things going, and Jim has offered solutions in really important ways. So really great questions, really great participation, and Jim, as always, passionate and the expert we always want to welcome back. If you'd like to listen to the recording or share it with people who weren't here, please do. It will be on our YouTube channel. I've put the link in the chat, and it will be there when one of us gets around to it, so in a couple of days. If you feel moved to donate at all, that's really appreciated. It helps us keep running events, just things like the Zoom. We have a cost and a website, that kind of thing. So if you feel moved to do that, any coinage you can put our way. It's PayPal actually, but that's really helpful. And just very quickly to tell you about our next event, it's going to be on Monday the 16th of May, something very different, but more of a sort of individual action kind of talk. It's going to be from campaigner Rosalind Redhead. She's going to be our speaker. She'll be talking about 1 ton carbon living. This is something she has done. This is really challenging and maybe a bit provocative, because she'll be getting us to look at the way people in the West need to be sort of honestly and thoroughly addressing their carbon emissions. So it might be a little bit uncomfortable. I think it's going to be really fascinating. So do join us then. If you're signed up for our Eventbrite or our emails, you'll get notification of that automatically anyway. And I think that's it. So thank you hugely, everybody. Thank you, of course, to Jim. Really good to have you. We really appreciate you giving up your time for us. It's really appreciated, such important subjects. And see you next time, everyone. Thank you.